Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and in this video we're going to be talking about saving your game content data to an external file, in particular saving it to XML. So say you're working on a game and you have a team member who has a lot of ideas for content but doesn't want to work right in Unity. Or you want to store some of your game content externally. There's many reasons you might want to do this. Maybe you want your game to have a smaller footprint when it's in your hard drive, so you want to store some of the files that you can just get from the internet. Or another great reason is that it'll be a lot easier to update. If you can just update these external files, and then whenever the player starts the game, they can just pull that updated file rather than having to download and update every time. Now that's kind of ventures into the always online territory, so there are some cons to that, but it's another possible reason. The last reason is ease of access. Having this file outside of Unity and outside of Unity's kind of file structure means that you can, especially with XML, you're going to be able to get into this file, look right at it, see exactly what it means, and edit it in a lot more easily, in much easier fashion. So, what is XML? Wikipedia describes XML as Extensible Markup Language. XML is a markup language that defines a set of rules for encoding documents in a format which is both human readable and machine readable. Now that definition is barely human readable, but basically what it's saying is that you're taking the information that's in Unity and you're going to be putting in this file that you can look at and at a glance kind of see, like an int's going to be called an int, a string's going to be called a string. If you name something specific, like if you have an int called value, it'll be called value. So it's going to be very easy for you to go into this text file and make those changes, and then you can re-import them into Unity. There are other options like this. There's also JSON files are very popular, and there are more powerful database type solutions like MySQL and other things that offer a little bit more functionality and more nuanced control of what your data is doing. But this is really just going to be kind of a primer into how you can save your data into an external file outside of Unity using a pre-existing file format. So some of the pros of this system, and this is kind of going to be specific to XML, but some of these pros are going to go to JSON and other solutions as well. So some of the pros, XML is a really easy language to learn. Like I say, it's human readable. So when you are going through it, once you can see a file of it, you're like, oh, that's exactly how it works. I get this now. One of the other nice things, though, is that it can be a little intimidating to try and start making one of these files, but the XML serializer in Unity, and technically through C# and the MSDN, will make that file totally for you. You don't have to actually worry about making the initial file. It can make it on its own. You can save entire classes, or you can save single data points, however you want to do that. It's very flexible. It also works really well with arrays and ultimately with lists, because one of the reasons you're going to be using this in often cases is that you have like a large amount of content that you want to save. For example, a list of items that a player can get in an RPG, or a list of enemies a player will have to fight. And that might change. You might start with only 2 items, but eventually you're going to have 20 items or 200 items, and so using a list gives you that flexibility, and XML handles that without missing a beat. And the last thing is that it's really, like I've said, it's human readable. It's easy to modify outside of Unity, which means that if you have team members that don't want to go into Unity, or frankly, even if you're okay with using Unity, a lot of times copying and pasting content inside of Unity can be a little bit cumbersome. And so this is kind of another solution for how you can quickly populate a list and then just import it into Unity without having to go through the struggle of copying and pasting into individual fields inside of the Unity editor. Some of the cons, this does require a little bit more of a intermediate level of coding in order to do the file access. You're going to be dealing with things like serializers, DataStreams, the system.io namespace, as well as the XML namespaces. So it's not just using what Unity gives you right away. So there's a little bit, it can be a little bit intimidating if you're not used to that, but we're going to go through all of that in this video. The other thing is that if you're ignoring certain fields when you're building the system, it can start getting a little bit cluttered in your scripts because you have to do a lot of what are called attributes overlines. And so what I often do when I'm to avoid this is that I make kind of a XML specific class that when I'm sort of like an intermediate class that's like, this is the information that's going to go to the XML file, so that I don't have to worry about adding in all of these extra things into my game code and suddenly looking and being like, well, why is this line here? Oh, I don't need this for gameplay. I just need it for the XML keeps things streamlined. Another con, if you're using a lot of enums, be careful, because if you mistype an enum in the XML file, it will kind of break down the system. The serializer will look at it and go, I don't have any reference for this, I can't do it. You might want to kind of swap out with just maybe an int reference to the enum or something. But again, we'll see that in the example I'm talking about later on in the video. And then lastly, I listed it as a pro. It's also kind of a con, is that it is very easy to modify these files outside of Unity. So you want to be careful that you don't have something that your player can just go. I mean, it's cool if you want people to be modding your game, but if you don't want them to, or you don't want them to be cheating through your game, you want to be kind of careful about how easily they can modify things, like going into their save file and saying, oh, I'm actually a level 20 person instead of a level 10 person, things like that. Just kind of a little bit of a gotcha to watch out for. So what is all this good for? XML is great for web-based games, because you can just kind of, it's a natural, much like HTML, XML kind of naturally fits into that environment, and you can actually kind of store whatever information you want into an XML file rather than storing it on their computer, which is really difficult to do when you're using the Unity web player. It's also great for saving, like I've said, lists of game content. When you have a lot of something, like a long list of, say, an item class you have many iterations of it. XML handles that really well. Likewise, if you want to do some sort of like an internet connected style of game data, so like I said before, that your actual game program on your computer is smaller and it's just pulling from this external source, it's good for that. It's also really good if you're creating your own development tools for creating content, because it gives you this sort of solution to how you can, create a tool that says, here, just put the item information into this tool and then save it as an XML file that then your game can pull into. Lastly, it's good for local game content, but not great for local game saves. And that's what I was saying before, is that it's really easy for someone to look at an XML file, know exactly what's going on in it, and make changes. So it's okay for content, because that's kind of where your, that information someone probably won't be interested in changing, but be careful with game saves with this, because it does make them very easy to mess with, and then you could have someone ruin their save and have a very frustrating experience with their game. So how this works is that when you're in Unity, you have this, your Unity class. I tend to call them a database. They're really just a file that has the information I'm storing. And it's going to have a bunch of information in it. It could have strings, it could have ints, it could have maybe an array of floats. You could even have things like anything that can really be stored as a text element. So even things like vector 3s or colors or even animation curves, stuff that you might even be surprised about. You have this file with that information, and then you're going to add an XML serializer, and that can read and write pretty much all of that information for you. It's worth noting it cannot read things like game objects or sprites, things that are, like an image file you can't just jam into a text file very easily, and likewise a game object has a lot of different components, so it doesn't read those automatically. But you can put the pertinent information, for example, say a position or a rotation, just make that into a vector 3 and store that into an XML file very easily. And so what happens is you add this XML serializer, and what that does for you is it will automatically find or create an XML file for you, and you can either read from it and put it into your game, or write to it and save it. And so that really is the crux of what makes this such a great system, is that you can take a surprising variety of information in a class that you've set up and port it almost seamlessly. There's maybe one or two things you might want to add in terms of XML language, but with very little effort then, so long as you're then able to open and close the files and the data stream, you're creating your own XML files really simply and really quickly. So that's actually probably the biggest step into this, like I've said, is opening these data streams and creating files and doing that through code. So that's what we're going to look at now in our example in Unity. Okay, so now we've jumped over to Unity to a very simple kind of a game setup that I have here. And what we're looking at is what might be, say, a shop in an RPG or in any game where you can get an item. That item is going to have a name, it's going to have a material, and it's going to have a value. And right now we're just displaying this in a quick little UI box here, and each one of these is its own individual item block. So I'm going to stop this and quickly show you the item display. Let me zoom in on these a little bit. The item display is really just a UI box that is displaying and kind of instantiating a bunch of these item blocks based right now on an iterator here. We're just saying for every 20 times we're going to display a block. And the item block is really a very simple object that just has a text field for name, a text field for material, and a text field for value. So you can do this with anything you want. You can just debug log in the console if you want. I just did that for a little bit more of a visual way of showing what's going on. What's really important here is this XML manager script, and that's the third script that I have here. If we go back to the editor, you'll see that I did create an empty object that has this XML manager script on it. I'm going to quickly reset the transform on that so it's at 0, 0, 0. Just kind of a best practice. So we go back into MonoDevelop, and we see here, all I've done with this right now is I've created a singleton pattern so that we can access this XML manager from these other two scripts as well. And so right now, all this is saying, is we have a static instance reference, and then I'm making sure that when we wake up, the instance is made to this XML manager. So in order to work with XML, we need some new namespaces in here. We can't just use Unity Engine and system collections. So we're going to add a few. I'm going to say using system.collections.generic for the first. And this isn't actually for XML. This is just going to lets us use lists. Because lists are, like I said, really powerful with XML because you don't necessarily know exactly how many of something you're going to have. You might be adding content as you go. So lists give you that flexibility. Next, we're going to say using system.xml. And this is just for the basic XML attributes. We're also going to be adding using system.xml.serialization. And this gives us access to the XML serializer, which is a special kind of serializer that will take our class and make it into an XML, specifically an XML file for us. And lastly, I'm going to add using system.io, and this is what we use to do file management. So even if you're doing, say, a custom file format, or you're using MySQL, or JSON, you're pretty much always going to want system.io because that's what lets you open and close files. Quickly save that, and I'm just keeping these separated here with this space solely for clarity of that these are the ones I've added. Next, what we're going to do is we need a couple of more bits of information here. Right now, all we have is this XML manager, but it doesn't have any content for the file that it's going to create. So we're going to create a couple of quick classes here. The first one I'm going to call public class item entry, because this is going to be kind of an entry into our file. And this is not going to inherit from monitor behavior, and because of that, we can just keep it in this XML manager class. You can put as many classes into a single file as you want, but the key thing that you have to do is that if you have a mono behavior, it has to be the name of the file, and it has to be the only mono behavior in the class. So XML manager is the mono behavior we're referencing in our XML manager file, but now we can add this item entry as its own thing. And now this, we're going to add a couple of things here. First I'm going to do is I'm going to say system.serializable up here. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to look at this in the inspector. We don't have to do this, but it's going to make seeing what we're doing a lot easier. Next, I'm going to add three things that we have here in our item block. We have name, material, and value. So I'm going to add those here. We're going to say public string. We'll say item name. I'm going to hold off on material for 1 second, but then I'll say public int value. Now it's important, this is going to be a class that gets stored in the XML file. And it's important that any variable that you want stored has to be public. Otherwise, the XML serializer is not going to look at it. And so for the material, I'm actually going to use an enum for this. I did say there's some gotchas with it, and you have to be careful with them, but for the purposes of right now, I think it's kind of cool to see how it actually does store them. So we're going to say public enum material, and we'll add a few materials here. We'll say wood, copper, iron, steel, and obsidian. So now I can go back up to here and say public material. Save that. So now this is an item entry that's going to appear in our XML file. But it's not, but where is the file we're creating is the other question. So in order to do that, we need to actually create a file class that's going to be. So I'm going to do system.serializable again because I want to be able to see this in our game. Oops, don't need those. I'm going to say public class item database, we'll call it. And now what this is going to have is a public list of item entries called, and I'll just call this list. And I'm going to say equals new list item entry. And I'm just going to do that here so that we don't have to worry about initializing the list elsewhere. So with all of this, we now actually have, this item database is going to be what gets made into a file for us, into an XML file. The item entries are what's going to be populating this list. We could create an XML file with an empty list, it's just not doing a whole lot for us. So now in order to see all this, though, what we need to do is we need to create a public reference to it in our XML manager. So I'm going to go below the awake function because this is all kind of the singleton pattern. So I'm going to start a new setup down here, and I'm going to say list of items. So we're going to say public item database, and I'll just call it itemdb. And we'll save that. So now if we go back into our editor here, should see that we have our item database here, and then our list right here. And currently its size is 0. But I can easily enough add, say, 1 to it. Now we get an element 0 here. Maybe we make our first item a shield, and we'll keep it as wood, and we'll say it's worth 3. So now we have in our XML manager, we have this list currently of just one item there. If we hit play, though, we see that we're not referencing it yet. So we're not pulling from this information, we're just creating the 20 blank items. So I'm going to quickly jump back over to item display. And instead of doing this way, what we can do is we can say here, start for each item entry item in XML manager .ints.itemdb.list. And that is a little bit lengthy, but we need itemdb here because this is what is being saved, and then this is the content within the file that's being saved. So for each item in this list, we can say display item. So now what we'll do down here is say add in item entry as a parameter, item entry item. And so now what we're going to do is say when we display, actually we're going to do this a little bit differently because I don't want this to happen in start. I want this to happen whenever we want to display, because once we get into updating and stuff, we're going to actually want to display not just at start. So I'm going to change this up a little bit here. I'm going to copy this line, paste it here, and then I'm going to add closing bracket there. We can delete all this. We don't need this here either. I am just going to say display here. So when we start, it's going to call this display function. And so for each item in XML Manager, we are instantiating our item block prefab, and then we are making the item block prefab a child of this display. And then lastly, we are going to say new block dot display, and we're going to pass in the current item entry that we're dealing with. So now in item block, we can quickly add a new public void function called display with an item entry parameter so that we're fulfilling exactly what we said here. And now what we can do is say name.text equals item.item name, material.text equals item.material.toString, and lastly value.text equals, and I'm going to add a quick $sign in front of this so that we know it's a monetary value. Then we'll add item.value.toString. The reason we're adding toString here for both the enum and for the int is because a lot of times text fields will throw an error if you try to just pass in anything except a string. So that just prevents that bug from happening. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you can get away with it. You can particularly get away with it if you're just doing a debug log, but it's always kind of good practice to just put in the toString there as well. So now, go back to item display, start display, we'll go through those. Okay, so we should be all set here. If I hit play now, we've got our one wooden shield, it's a value of 3. We hit play, and sure enough, that's what we get now. I could add another item. You could say have a spear. It's made of copper, and it's maybe twice as valuable, so it's value of 6. We hit play again. And we're adding those in. Now we have both of those. So that's all well and good. But, you know, this is fine for 2 items here. But what if this is where XML is going to help us, is what if we want to add another, another 2 items or another dozen items, or we might have hundreds of items by the time we're done and actually releasing our game. That's where we want to start saving this into an XML file. So how we're going to do that is we're going to jump back to our XML manager, and we're going to add a couple of functions here. We're going to add save function, and we're going to add a load function. So our save function, we're going to say public void save items. And now what we need to do is we need to open a new XML file. How do we do this? We need 2 things that I kind of talked about before in order to save Unity information into a file. First thing we need is an XML serializer, and that's what's going to take Unity data and make it into XML data. We can do that because we have our XML system serialization here. And we can say XML serializer, we'll just call that serializer, equals a new XML serializer, and you need to determine what kind of type it is, because that's basically, this is going to tell the XML serializer, hey, this is the kind of class that you're converting to or from. So in this case, we're creating an item database. It's not letting me, let me quickly close that all off. Item database, there we go. Sometimes if you leave your brackets open, Monitor Develop gets a little confused. Okay. The next thing we need is what's called a file stream. And a file stream is basically, instead of looking at like an object-oriented C# programming that we do in Unity, when you're creating a file, we're just kind of putting in this stream of data, this ones and zeros, this is how we make a file, and it's just kind of spitting it out all in one big string. That's a file stream. So we can add that by saying file stream, and we'll just call it stream, equals a new file stream. And a file stream needs two things. It needs a string that's its path, that's where are we putting this file, and it needs a file mode, which is how are we opening it. So for the path, there are two main paths you're going to use in Unity. The first is called application.dataPath. The second is called application.persistentDataPath. And the easiest way to think of it is this. If you're doing game content, if you're doing your items, your enemies, your levels, all that, you want it in application.dataPath. If you're doing a game save onto someone's computer, you want application.persistentDataPath. So this is content right now, so we're going to say application.dataPath. And then we need to add, that basically brings you to the root of your projects folder. So we need to add a little bit more here. It brings you actually to the assets folder. So it'll bring you, if I just have data path like this, it will plop whatever I create down right here in the assets folder. So that's not where I want it. I want to keep my folder a little bit more organized than that. So I'm actually going to create a new folder in here. I'm going to call this streaming files. And then I'm going to create one more folder inside of here too. And this is, obviously you don't have to do this. You can have your organization however you want it. But I'm going to create one more file and call it XML, just in case I was to say have another, maybe I also have a MySQL database that I'm using to store player information or other things like that. So we're going to be storing this inside of that root, streaming files, XML. So that's pretty easy to do here. We just say plus, quote, you want the forward slash. Then we're going to say streaming files / XML / and you do need to include your file name. So in this case, I'm going to say item data.xml, and then we'll close that quote. So that's the first thing you need for a file stream. The second thing you need is your file mode. And we're going to say file mode. You'll see there's a bunch of different ones here. There's open or create, truncate. We're going to do create. Now it's worth noting that when you create a file like this, let me swing over here. You need a semicolon at the end of our line. When you create a file, worth noting, you're going to overwrite anything that already exists there. So right now that's fine for our purposes, but be advised that if at any point you don't want to risk overwriting something important, you might want to use other file modes. But for right now, this will work for our purposes. So now we've got our serializer ready to go, and we've got our stream. That's basically our file is open now and ready. It's basically like we've opened a brand new file and saying, okay, put information into me. So now what we can do is we'll start a new line, and we're going to say serializer. We're going to talk to the serializer and say, hey, create, put information into this file for us. So the first thing we need to give it, if you go down one, the first one here is a text writer, don't worry about that, but if you go down to the second input, you get this stream and object. So first thing we're going to do is give it the stream, which is why we just named it stream, and then you need the object, which is, in this case, our item database. So we can just say item db. And so what this line is doing right now, once we get to here, the XML serializer is going to take that information. This is where it's actually taking the information from the Unity class, putting it into an XML file for us. And lastly, we can just say stream.close. That's a very important thing, because if you were to say, we're going to actually put in a button that will tell it to save these items. And if you were to accidentally save it and then try to save it again and the file was still open, you're going to throw an error. It doesn't, unlike in your file explorer, when you double click on the file and then open it again, it knows what to do. It's fine. It doesn't yell at you. Unity will say, no, we can't open this file. It's already open. That's going to create the same stream twice, and Ghostbusters say you can't cross the streams. So make sure whenever you're done with a stream, be sure to close it. So now, let's jump back over to Unity. We're going to create a really quick button here. Zoom out a little. Go to our canvas. I'm going to pull up this display a little bit here. And then I'm going to say canvas UI button, drag it down here. We'll rename it save button. We could just actually keep that as text, but I want to change this to save items. And when we go back to our button here, on click, we're going to add our XML manager, and we're going to say XML manager save items. So now when we press this button, it's going to talk to the XML manager and say, hey, this list of items you have right here, save that to an XML file. So let's see that in action. I'm actually going to open this up too here. So this is where the file should end up. Let's see if this works. Hit play. Got our shield and our spear. I say save items. Nothing appeared there, but it might just be because it needs to stop. And that did not appear to work. Oh, nope, it did. Just needed a second to compile, because now we see it here. Item data. Yeah, that worked just fine for us. So now I'm going to show this in the Explorer for a second here, because then I want to right-click on this, and I'm going to open it in, you can open this in literally any text editor you want. I like Sublime Text because it has good organization and kind of color codes everything for you. But you can honestly open this in Notepad. So like I said before, if you have someone that doesn't want to do this, doesn't want to download Unity and edit stuff in Unity, you can say, hey, as long as you have TextEdit or Notepad or something, you can open this file, look at it, and make changes. So open this up, and here we see now our item database, or our XML file. So first thing we have here is what says item database, and some boilerplate information for XML kind of metadata. Then we have our list, and so what this is literally, when we go back down to our item database, we have item entry list, and then our two item entries. We've got this one here, that's one whole item entry, which is the name is shield, the material, this is that enum I was telling you about. The enum is wood, so it's written exactly like it should be, wood, same as we had it in our enum list, and then its value is 3. And it knows when the XML serializer looks at this, we're not saying it's an int or anything here, but because of how the serializer works, and we told it, oh, you're a serializer that's an item type of an item database, it knows, oh, I see value, that means an int. Likewise, I see material, that means that material enum you created. I see item name, that means I'm looking for a string. And then we have our second item here. And now, if you're familiar with HTML at all, this is going to look very similar. You're doing, your bracket start item entry / end item entry. Very structurally similar to that, or even kind of like CSS in a way. So that's why, again, this is very visually obvious to look at and say, oh, okay, this is exactly, what I'm working with. This is the item's name. This is the item's material. Human readable. That's your benefit. Now, we notice here list isn't super descriptive. It would be nice if that actually said, what it's a list of. Maybe we have one list that's all weapons. Maybe we have another list that's all potions, things like that. Maybe we want to kind of have that be a little bit more clear in our XML file. This is where XML attributes come in. If we go back to MonoDevelop, we see here that we added system.xml for our basic XML attributes. And what that means that we can do is if I come down here to our list, I can say, instead of calling it a list, let's say XML array, and then we're going to pass it in a string. We'll say combat equipment. I recommend not using spaces because it interprets them kind of weirdly. It shows the code for them rather than actually showing a space. So we'll call this XML array combat equipment. Save that. So now if I go back here, play, and save it again, we see that this is now, instead of calling list, it's called combat equipment. So that's a way that if you want to call a variable something that's more in your system, but you want to give the person using the XML file a little more information, you can use attributes like that to customize your XML file a little bit better. So now what we can do as well, though, is say we want to add a new item. We can copy and paste this information in our text editor. And let's say we have a hammer that's made of iron and has a value of 13. Save that here. Now, what we need to do is load that information into our Unity file. So how we do that is we're going to create a second function here called public void load items. We're going to actually copy these first two lines, paste them in here. We're going to create another serializer. That's an XML serializer, and it's going to be looking for an item database. We're going to create another file stream. The only thing we're going to change, though, and we want it in the same location, but we're going to change this to file mode open. So now it knows to look for, instead of creating and overwriting a file, it's going to open the existing file. Now you should probably create, in this case we know one exists, it's probably a good idea to create a just a quick check to make sure that a file does exist before you try to open it, but we'll skip that right now. And so now what we can do is say itemDB equals serializer.deserialize, so we're taking this string of information and making it back into objects for us. And all we have to do is give it the file. Whereas here you're passing in both the stream and the object that you're making into a file, here we're just going to say the object will equal this deserialized file. And again, make sure to close your file when you're done. So now, if we go back, cannot implicitly convert. Oh, I'm getting a slight error here. Cannot implicitly convert an object to an item database, and that is because when we do this, it just gives you an object, and we want it to make sure that it is an item database. We just need to say as item database. Save that, and that should go away now. Yes, all good there. So now we're going to create a new button here. We're going to duplicate this button. I'm going to call this load button. Clarify our label to load items, and I'm going to move it over here. Oops. Not just the text, I'm going to move the whole button. Come on. And I'm going to, instead of saying save items, we're going to say XML manager load items. Save that. And I'm actually going to add one more object here. I'm going to add the item display because I want to, in addition to loading the items, I want to refresh the display quickly. So we'll save that. Hit play. And now we're still right now showing, because our list here only has those two items, that's all we're showing. But now if I click load items, it will get the 3 items we have here. So go back to our game, click load items, and sure enough, it's not only is it added here, now we didn't clear the first 2 objects, so it added another, kind of duplicated those, but we see here that we've got the exact 3 objects that we have in our file. So quickly fix that item display issue. I'm just going to add a quick thing here and say for each transform child in transform. So this is literally just looking at every child of our item display. Destroy child.gameObject. So that will clear anything that's in there. That's just kind of a cleanup thing. So now once again, if we do this, hit play, load items, now it's cleared and repopulated these with the 3 that we have. And again, we can go back and we can add even more to this. We can copy these, paste another here, say there's a sword made of steel that's worth $22. Maybe another one, maybe we have an axe made of obsidian that's $29. Save that. So now we have 5 items in our data here. Oops. Hit play. Load our items, and now we have all 5. Now it is worth noting that when we do this, we've got the 5 in our XML manager right now, but if we stop it, they go away. And that's because, as we discussed in the scriptable objects video, Unity doesn't save any changes that you make during your game. If you want to save these into here and make them persist here, which you shouldn't really need to do, because in theory what you would actually do is whenever you start your game, you would automatically load the XML file you have. But if you did for some reason want to, you might want to then store it in a scriptable object in your Unity file, and that would persist between times that you run your game. Anyway though, this is really the basics of how to use XML, how to create a file, saving and loading files, and I will just quickly mention here too that this system here, creating a serializer of some sort, opening a stream, and then just serializing or deserializing is really the crux of any kind of external file use that you're going to do. When we look at custom files as well, we're going to be using this exact same structure. I'm just not using specifically XML. So that's a really handy tool to have in your toolbox. If you take nothing else from this video, I would take these 4 lines of code away because, or these 8 lines technically of code away, because that's really where you're going to get the power to create save game files, save files to your player's computer when they need to save files, as well as saving content that you're creating. So anyway, that's XML. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.